Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, 52 Words, the Meaning and Message of the Preamble. I'm Martin Andrews, Creative Director at InquireEd, and today's webinar is the last in our spring series, Strong Communities Start with Social Studies. That's presented by the National Council for the Social Studies and InquireEd. A few things to note: on Tuesday of next week, you'll receive an email with links to view the recording and request a certificate of attendance. We'll also share with you any information or resources shared by our panelists today. Also note that the chat is active, and if you use it, please use it to ask questions. We'll try to respond right away or answer them at the end of the webinar. I really think that you're going to have some questions for our panelists today, so please use that chat, get it fired up. Actually, we'll start right now. If you haven't already, introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining from and what's your role in education. Are you a teacher, a curriculum coordinator, instructional coach, principal? Please share. I will get us started. There you go. Would love to know where you're coming from and what your role is in education. Hello, David. Great to see you in the audience. Heather, Talon, Barbara. Thank you so much for coming. Share there and let us know where you're coming from. Although this is the last webinar in our series, we do have a spring series that we are going to announce the webinars for soon, so stay tuned for updates. Our spring series is Deeper Learning in Social Studies. Join NCSS and InquireEd. Each webinar explores the strategies, tools, and research-based practices to engage students, deepen their knowledge, and help them form meaningful connections in social studies. Stay tuned for that. I mentioned that the series is brought to you by InquireEd and NCSS. The National Council for the Social Studies is the largest professional association in the country devoted solely to social studies education. They do so much to advocate for and support social studies educators. These webinars, their conference that many of you might have just gotten back from, the institutes in the summer, and their publications, social education, social studies in the young learner, middle level learning, theory and research, and social education. Go to socialstudies.org. There's a tab that's publications and resources. Check out those. If you don't subscribe, you might want to do that. They are great resources. They're also looking for contributions too, so check that out. The webinar is also brought to you by InquireEd. InquireEd supports teachers with high-quality instructional materials that make joyful, rigorous, and transferable learning possible for every student. Our social studies curricula, Inquiry Journeys, K-5, and Middle School World History are used across the country to help students build deep content knowledge and develop the inquiry skills essential for a thriving democracy, and we all want that. Find out more at inquireed.org. Reach out. We'd love to chat about social studies. Please, we love the social studies. We live and breathe it, just like you all do. Reach out, and we'd love to have a conversation. Right now, I would like to invite our panelists to turn on their cameras and join us here today. And you probably will want to unmute yourself too. I want to welcome former Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy. Stephanie is a former U.S. Congresswoman serving 3 terms from 2017 to 2023, where she was consistently recognized as one of the most effective and bipartisan members. She led efforts to lift the federal gun violence research ban and secured tax benefits for businesses during the pandemic. She played a key role in advancing historic infrastructure and climate investments. Before Congress, she was a national security specialist at the U.S. Department of Defense, where she helped to shape U.S. policy in the Asia-Pacific arena. by fostering cooperation in capacity building, disaster preparedness, special operations, and counterterrorism. Former Congresswoman Murphy, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So great to be with you.
I also want to introduce Professor Akhil Reed Amar. He is the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches constitutional law at both Yale College and Yale Law School. Widely recognized as one of America's top legal scholars, his work has been cited in over 4 dozen Supreme Court cases, and he regularly testifies before Congress. His latest book, I have it right here. The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840, explores the founding era through the lens of the Constitution and its transformative power, offering insights into the words that shaped our nation. Professor Amar, thank you for joining us as well.
Thanks.
And finally, Colonel Elliott Bales, U.S. Army retired, served for 26 years in a distinguished military career that included assignments across the U.S. and around the world. He commanded 1st Battalion, 44th Air Defense Artillery, transforming it into the Army's first combined long-range and short-range air and missile defense battalion. His operational deployments included Operation Joint Guard and Joint Forge in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Operation Iraqi Freedom in Iraq. Strategic assignments include tours with the Joint Staff, Army Staff, Multinational Force Iraq Staff, and as Director for Warfighter Interface and Missile Defense Agency. He's a graduate of the Air Defense Officer Basic and Advanced Courses, the Combined Arms Staff Services School, the Command and Staff College, and the National War College, where he earned an MS in National Security Strategies. His awards include the Army Achievement Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, the Meritorious Service Award, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star. Colonel Bales, thank you for being here with us today as well.
Thanks, Martin, and a huge thanks to all of our educators and to Professor Amar, who are doing the lion's work of teaching our next generation of citizens the significant responsibility of social studies and being a citizen of the United States.
Yeah, thanks so much. I want to start out with a reading of the preamble. We want to talk about the preamble, the Constitution as a whole, what it means to us. But I thought we would start out with just a reading, and I asked Colonel Bales if you would read the preamble for us.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Thank you. First question goes to you, Professor Amar, and I talked before as I really want this to be a discussion, so we can go anywhere we want to go as we get into our discussion, but your book, The Words That Made Us, explores the constitutional origins. I want to ask you, why do these words matter and how are they still making us today?
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be with my colleagues, and I want to thank them both for their service to our country, military and civilian. So the words are familiar. I've been looking at the chat, and one of the participants said, oh, we memorized that, and I love that. So now the next step is to actually understand it, because they're familiar, but what does it mean? So first, they put the thing to a vote, they being the founding generation. We, the people, do ... for various reasons, ordain and establish this Constitution. They put it to a vote up and down a continent. That had never happened before in world history. Never before in the history of planet Earth had so many people been allowed to vote on how they and their posterity would be governed. There weren't very many democracies or self-governing societies, republics, in 1787 or in 1687 or all the 87s going back to the dawn of time. And the few that there were didn't always have written constitutions, and even the ones that did had never put constitutions to a vote before. Not ancient Athens, not the Spartans, not the Roman Republic. The Brits don't have a written constitution. So wow, that's big news. It's the big bang of world history, the hinge of world history, because the world will never be the same after an entire continent votes on the thing. And in 8 of the 13 states, the qualifications to vote on this thing are lower than the ordinary property qualifications that exist otherwise. So this is really special, and you won't hear that, some of you, if you just think that Howard Zinn is, for example, telling it to you straight. He sold a lot of copies, but he didn't tell you that. Charles Beard didn't tell you that. I try to tell you that. So first, we, the people, are actually doing something. If I say to you, I promise, I've just promised, I agree, I consent. And, I've been married for 35 years. At a certain moment, very happily, I said, I do. Oh, and I was very careful when I said it because I just did it. We do is a deed. It's an ordainment. It's an establishment. Okay. An act, a constituting. And then they tell us why, which is really interesting. And just very briefly, here's how the whys connect. We need to have a more perfect union. That is an indivisible union. And we need to do that because actually, unless we indivisibly unite, the monarchical powers of Europe are going to slice and dice us. Okay, so we need to. Britain is 3 times as big, 4 or 5 if you count Ireland. France is 3 times bigger than Britain, and they've got their eyes on what we call the New World, this continent. And unless we create an indivisible union, Lincoln understood this, Washington understood this. We're not going to be able to protect common defense, and without a common defense, actually, you're not going to have the blessings of liberty because you're going to be actually saluting some European dictator. And this isn't just for our generation. It's for later generations, our posterity. And now here's the final tricky thing. In order to create a continental system, there are going to need to be some compromises. And maybe the biggest one of all was about slavery, the 3/5 clause. We haven't even gotten into it yet. We've only got the first 52 words, but we had to create a union in order to defend ourselves, common defense, which would protect liberty and posterity. But that required some compromises that at the end of the day are going to result, frankly, in a civil war. Oh, and that's volume 2. Volume 1 is up to 1840, 1760 to 1840, how we become a we, the words that made us, the U.S., how we come together, but then we come apart and come back together. That's volume 2. Stay tuned.
Thank you so much. I think there's a personal resonance to these words in many cases. And one of the questions that I had for you, former Congresswoman Murphy, is I know a little bit about your family's story and your family's journey and your journey. And I wonder about that phrase that Professor Amar just repeated, the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, and how that maybe likely, based on your story, holds a pretty significant personal meaning. And I wonder if you could share your story with us and explain how those words connect to your experience and give you a unique perspective.
Sure. And I have to say that I'm really honored to be here with the professor and the colonel. And I think there might be a joke in there somewhere, Professor, Colonel, Congresswoman. But I'm really glad to be here with you all and happy to talk about this topic. I think it's so critically important. But my story is that, I wasn't lucky enough to be an American born here in the United States. I was born, but like many foreign-born Americans, sometimes you love and appreciate the things that America offers more deeply and intensely because you know what the alternative looks like. I was born in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and my parents had worked for the U.S. military as well as for the South Vietnamese government. So they were the very type of people who were being persecuted by their very own government. And looking at the possibility of raising children in a country that didn't have opportunity, where there wasn't liberty and that their government was persecuting them, they made a really dangerous decision. They decided to escape by boat in the dead of night with a 6-month-old daughter, me, and an 8-year-old son, and a few dozen other Vietnamese people. And so they got to international waters and they simply ran out of fuel. And there they were, dangerously adrift. And I was too young to really understand what was going on, but I know that the adults on this boat probably were wondering whether or not this was their end. And miraculously, a U.S. Navy ship found our little boat and gave us the food, fuel, and water we needed to make it to a Malaysian refugee camp. And this moment really changed the course of my entire life, but it's also the moment that makes me understand what makes America great. And it's this combination of power and generosity. And it's the power to be able to deploy sailors thousands of miles from our own shores to protect sea lanes and freedom of commerce and freedom of navigation, and to basically have people who are trained for combat extend grace to these desperate strangers in the spirit of what makes them the spirit of generosity that makes up America. Well, we were able to relocate to the United States, and I was able to live the American dream, going to a great public school education and on to college and on to careers in the private sector. But when 9/11 happened and I saw my country under attack, I quit my job and went back to school and went to work at the Department of Defense. I see public service as a way to pay off this debt that my family owes this country, but also a way to contribute to protecting all of the things that make it great. So that's the posterity piece. That's making sure that these things still exist for my kids and for the generations that come after us. And that's really the story of America, is that each generation builds on the last in order to make a more perfect union.
Thank you. I think when I think Colonel Bales, when I think about those soldiers, meeting Congresswoman Murphy's family and helping them, that's I imagine that is something that makes you kind of proud. And I want to ask a question that, like, the blessings of liberty, it stands as a principle. It's capitalized. I know capitalization was like choose your own adventure back then in a lot of times. But the blessings of liberty is capitalized. It stands as a principle, a concept. Provide for the common defense is lowercase. It's a mission. It's a duty. It's a responsibility. And I wonder about what these words meant to you throughout 26 years of service, and if you have a moment that you can share where they felt especially present or impactful in your experience.
Slightly different take on the question, because even though it's capitalized blessings of liberty, there's a task that comes before it, and that is to secure the blessings of liberty. And the securing the blessings of liberty and our liberty is something that is always in balance, or tries to maintain a balance with common defense. Benjamin Franklin is attributed for famously saying that those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. When I started being one of the older people on this panel, when I started flying as a kid, you just showed up with a ticket and got on the airplane. And over time, from the hijackings of the 70s through 9/11 and things that have happened since then, we've given up that, as a microcosm, that sense of certain liberties to be able to have greater security. And so those two things are always, the first thing I think is that those two things are mentioned specifically that they have to have a balance. And we are constantly going to move levers based on what is happening in the moment. As Professor Amar pointed out, the second thing I would say about it is that the function of and the instrument that's used to provide for the common defense are subservient not to a sovereign, not to the military class, not to the wealthiest or the elite, but to we the people. And so it establishes very early on that there will be a subservience of the military to civilian leadership. So I think right at the very beginning, we set that precedence that it is not going to be its own thing, separate and apart and controlling how we govern ourselves and how we constitute ourselves. The second thing was, the last thing would, in that case would be that it's, as both Professor Amar and Representative Murphy have talked about, is the decisions of the moment are not ever going to be able to stand alone. What may seem exigent right now has to also be balanced with what happens for our posterity. Over 20 years ago, we decided to commit the military instrument of power into Afghanistan and Iraq. We have people in Iraq and Syria today, and off the coast of Yemen, who are conducting combat operations that weren't born on September 11th, 2001. And yet they are engaged in executing those decisions that we made as a country and that our leaders made and have promulgated across both parties and across multiple leaders to continue to do that. I find that function of, and in that framework, is something that happened all the time. As a military commander, I have the authority to mete out justice. I convened courts martial. I had certain authorities to judge as a commander issues that are allocated to me in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So that always resonated with, am I staying within the principles of law established in our Constitution for establishing justice? The fact that we have, as Stephanie talked about, that we frequently used military force to support civil authorities in disaster relief, because we have a capacity to do that. The one that keeps coming up even now, and certainly in the last several years, has been the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which said you cannot use federal forces to enforce political decisions against citizens of the United States. And that was modified in 2021. So we continue to have that discussion with this living document, still anchored in these words in the preamble. And then I think the last thing for me was that we've moved from providing for the common defense being defending the homeland, defending our territories, defending our citizens, and upholding treaties that we made, to defending our allies, to about 30, 40 years ago beginning to add national interests, both our economic interests, our humanitarian interests, and using those as a basis for the application of military power. Does that fit within the term of provide for the common defense of we the people? That's a debate that goes on every time we make a decision about the application of military force.
I'm struck by both that in what you just said, Colonel Bales and Representative Murphy, that idea of like the balance and the continual question of achieving that balance of what do these words actually mean? How do we prioritize one over the other? And I think, Professor Amar, these debates about what these words actually meant, and the contradictions that were present when they were coined, when the Constitution was created. This Constitution was built by people with wildly different views of the world, I think, probably. And specifically, the blessings of liberty included those who upheld slavery. Like, how then did they manage to come together despite those contradictions? And I think for people who see that as a hypocrisy, does it take away from the meaning of the words, or are they still lasting and valuable in what they represent?
Well, so we're moving beyond 52 words to the whole document, and it's short. Okay, it's way shorter than actually many state constitutions today. And there are some compromises. Not all the compromises are ambiguities. Some of them, they're just very clear. For example, the 3/5 clause, which means that slave states are going to get extra seats in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College based on the number of slaves. And a lot of people say, oh, that's horrible. Everyone's equal. It should be equal. That would be 5/5. No, that would have been worse. Because the question isn't actually how slaves are valued, but how much extra clout slave states are going to get because of the existence of slavery in their states, and to repeat, the House of Representatives and therefore the Electoral College, because the number of seats in the Electoral College is based on the number of seats in the House plus the number of seats in the Senate. Okay, so that's not an ambiguity. That's really clear. It's stinky. It should have been 0/5. But they had to get the South and the North on board. Otherwise, there's not a unified geographic front. And if you don't have a unified geographic front, then enemies can have a beachhead, a toehold in America and attack the other states. So that was a compromise. Now, here's the next thing I want to say. So you have to move from 52 words to the whole thing. Oh, and you can read it in an hour. And it was short, not so judges can make stuff up, but so the people 225 years ago, 250 years ago, could actually read the thing and decide for themselves whether to vote for it or against it. But now here's the next point, okay? It was shorter back then because there weren't amendments. And we've added amendments and they've made amends, many of them, for some of the biggest lapses and hypocrisies. So actually now we're moving from the 1840 end date of the words that made us this big fat book. Okay, I'm saying you got to move from 52 words to the whole thing. Oh, and then to understand the whole thing, you got to read, history and know the background. But this one only takes you up to 1840. But the new book, Born Equal, is going to tell you how we're going to make amends, we the people, with the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, abolishing slavery everywhere, immediately, without compensation. Wow. And a 14th Amendment, promising that everyone born in the United States is born a citizen, even if you're born brown or black, even if you're born children of slaves. Congresswoman wasn't lucky enough to be born in the United States. She was naturalized. I was lucky enough to be born in the United States. And it didn't matter that my parents weren't citizens the day I was born, because the 14th Amendment first sentence says everyone born in the United States, black, white, male, female, Jew, Gentile, in wedlock, out of wedlock, whether you're born to citizen parents or to non-citizen parents, firstborn, fifthborn, you're a citizen. And then the 15th Amendment comes along and it says actually no race discrimination in voting. And later a 19th Amendment is going to come along and say no sex discrimination in voting. And in our lifetime, a 26th Amendment is going to come along and say no age discrimination against young adults in voting. If you're old enough to fight at the founding, poor people actually were, people without property were allowed to be members of the House, the Senate, even the presidency, because they fought in the American Revolution. And then black men, Denzel Washington in that movie Glory, with Matthew Broderick, black men fight in the Civil War and they get the vote. And women get the vote in World War I a kind of Rosie the Riveter story. They're supporting the war effort, and Woodrow Wilson actually supports women's suffrage as a war measure. And in our lifetime, if you're old enough to fight in Vietnam, and where Stephanie's family comes from, if you're an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old, the Constitution is going to be amended to say if you're old enough to fight and be drafted, put your body at risk for the rest of us, you're old enough to vote on whether we should be in that war, because Elliott said, listen, at the end of the day, the military carries out the civilian decisions. So we, the people, have to decide who's in the House, who's in the Senate, who's present. They make the rules, and then the military carries them out. And if you're old enough to be drafted to be in the military, then you're old enough to to vote. If you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote on where the military should be deployed. So on the hypocrisy front, yes, there were stinky compromises. It's not all ambiguous. Sometimes it's really clear, some of these compromises. 3/5 is not ambiguous. It's just not great. But we didn't stop with the original Constitution. We have made amends over time, and I think we're not there yet. I think the Constitution could still be better, and that's the job of the next generation. That's the job of the social science teachers, because the next generation isn't going to be able to do that unless they know the story thus far. And that's why I laughed, because one of the people in your chat said, Professor Amar is very fond of saying, and I am, read the damn book, okay? Because you can't, because 52 words is way, way too, small an ask. Even reading the whole Constitution is way, way too small an ask. You need to know the story behind it, and you're not going to learn that in an instant, but you need to learn it because it's the only thing that we Americans have in common. We don't have race, we don't have ethnicity, religion, geographically we're dispersed, politically we're very dispersed. What we have, some of us came recently, Stephanie's family, my family, some of our families came a long time ago, some in chains, some with bullwhips in the hand. What we have in common, all of us Americans, is this, not just the 52 words, but the whole Constitution, and including the amendments, and then the story behind it. Well, that's history and social studies, civics, and God bless you all, people out there in the audience, because that's what you do. You serve our country, in my view, every bit as much as the Congresswoman and the Colonel.
So you're holding that in your hand. It's a small document, so I'm sure then, right?
But there are those who love it.
Yes. Congresswoman Murphy, I mean, it's just a short little document, so I'm sure that we should all be able to agree on, how it's interpreted. But the contradictions, if I said there were contradictions, divisions, and polarizations during the founding of America, contradictions, divisions, and polarizations, I think most people would associate those words with Congress right now. And they seem to sum up the environment of the House of Representatives where you served. And yet, when you served there, you were known for your bipartisanship. And that's something that you're proud of. Can you talk a little bit about, or give an example of working with colleagues despite those deep divisions, and if it was a we the people mindset, you were unified by your duty as set out in the Constitution? Can you talk to us a little bit about that bipartisanship?
Sure. And I think I was driven by two kind of general principles when I served in Congress that enabled me to be one of the most bipartisan and therefore one of the most effective members of Congress. And the first one is that I made a promise to my constituents that I would always put people over politics. And that was deeply important to me. And the second thing is that I believe that no party has a monopoly on good ideas or bad behavior. And we're seeing that play out in lots of different ways in our politics, which I think, all kidding aside, really does undermine people's faith in our political system. And I certainly think that people who are given the privilege to be in elected office owe it to this country and the legacy to conduct themselves in a way that's commensurate with the office that they hold. But the example I'll give about bipartisanship, because I saw a lot of Floridians on this call, is about advancing gun violence during Trump's first administration as a Democratic freshman in a Washington completely controlled by Republicans. And that is a very improbable proposition. I came into office wanting to address gun violence because I represented an area in Orlando that had been deeply affected by the Pulse nightclub shooting, where 49 innocent individuals had been, whose lives had been taken by an act of both hate and terrorism. And I knew I wanted to try to address this, that there had to be a way that we could protect the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens while also ensuring that, we could keep weapons of war out of the hands of people who intended to do harm in our community streets. And so I had introduced, when I came into Congress, a bill to simply lift the 22-year ban on gun violence research. I figured that wherever you fell on the spectrum of how to address gun violence in this country, let's start at a place of facts. And I couldn't believe that there was a ban on conducting a federal funding of gun violence. And for a year, I only had Democrats on this bill. And co-sponsors. But in order to have a bill move in a Republican Congress, you have to have some Republicans. And then the tragedy of Parkland happened, and I think it shook Florida, and it shook the country to see children, slain in school. And then something really amazing happened. The students that were affected at Parkland had been the recipients of this incredible civics education that is part of Florida's education system. It was a bipartisan effort. It was Bob Graham, and I'm blanking on the Republican that worked together with them to ensure that civics education happens in 7th grade in the public schools here in Florida. But it was because these students had that sort of understanding of how to call upon their legislators and how to use their voice in a democracy that you started to see the Parkland students really agitating and advocating for some sort of gun violence reform to happen. And then President Trump invited a bipartisan, bicameral group to the White House. And this was the time in which he did all of his meetings at the White House on TV. So usually a meeting with the president, you do a flat, bunch of photos, and then the press goes away. Well, the press didn't go away. He kept them all in the room to watch the conversation that was happening. And I was the most junior person sitting at this table with all these senators and senior members of the House. And my staff is sitting back in the Capitol, hoping I'm going to get a chance to say something. And you can tell that the meeting is about to wrap up. It's gone almost to an hour, and I haven't had a chance to speak yet. You don't know what that's like until you're in a room full of senators. And so finally I get the last word. And I say to the president, no matter where you are on this, on solving this, let's start with the facts. I have this bill. I'd love your support. And then I hung out after the meeting, and I had a little note card. And at this time, when he would tweet things, legislation would move. And so I walked up to the president and I handed him this note card that had in very simple language what my bill would do. And I said, this is the details for what I just talked to you about. And if you can support this, please tweet about it. And then a senator walked up, and she had a card with just photos on it, and she handed it to him and said, made her own plea. But as I was walking out of the room of this meeting, the Vice President Pence said to me, of all the proposals that were discussed today at this meeting, yours is one I can live with. And so I knew I wasn't going to face a veto. And I just had gotten sort of White House approval. And at this point, all my Republican friends are tweeting thoughts and prayers to our Florida families. And so I engaged in a Twitter trolling. I basically tweeted every single one of them that would express thoughts and prayers. I said, thank you for your thoughts and prayers. Sign on to this bill. And I got my first Republican to sign on to my bill. And it was a Republican from Florida, Carlos Curbelo at the time. And after he signed on, I got more and more Republicans to sign on. And now my bill was bipartisan. And so we were able to convince the Republican leadership to include the language of this bill in the broader suspending bill that we always pass. And we passed it, and it passed the Senate, and it made its way to President Trump's desk, where he signed it, and we lifted the 22-year ban on gun violence research. Follow-on year, we added some money to that effort, but that was something that was done in a very bipartisan way on behalf of people who are being affected by gun violence all across this country. And it, to me, is a reflection of putting people over the political noise that can often exist by putting forward just reasonable proposals and working together.
It doesn't happen without a lot of hard work to get it started.
And some Twitter.
And some tweets. Thanks for that story. We've got some questions that are starting to come in the chat, and we'll get to them shortly. I just want to, ask something of you, Colonel Bales. We hear about divisions and conflict and contradictions, and in situations in the military, I'm sure that contradictions and situations where orders are opposed to each other, like those are things that you want to avoid. But the tension between an oath to the Constitution, which you take, and an illegal order can arise, and that can force difficult decisions. Is that a concept that actively lives in the mind of leadership, and how is that addressed in the military? We hear a lot about it, and I just wonder if you can comment about that oath to the Constitution and your duty to obey an order.
Before I get to that very serious question, and this is also serious, is I learned the preamble to the Constitution through Schoolhouse Rock. And so every time a question comes up about the Constitution, every time I'd get an order, every time I'd have to be making a decision, I would start going, "We the people in order form." And, that's how it sticks with me to this day. And I would love for the social studies community to find a way to work with artists to get that back to where that's the way in which we get things drilled into our heads for all of our students, and then eventually, hopefully, all the citizens that they become, the active citizens that they become. I would say first, structurally, every level of command has now legal counsel. And so before an order gets issued, you look at it and go, this is what we need to do to accomplish this purpose. Can I do that? What are the legal implications of me doing that? I cannot remember a single time when I was ever issued an illegal order in 26 years of service. I remember, but it's always never, it's very seldom a question of legality. As Professor Marr said, the words are there. The words are the words. They're not ambiguous. They are very clear. But there are always questions of ethics and morals. And so your personal morality, your perception of the values of the nation, and the ethical dilemma that you frequently find yourself in is something that you at least have to go to a baseline. And the baseline is going to be, is this providing for the common defense? Is this promoting the general welfare? I think that for me, the place where that dilemma was most present was in the decisions to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan wasn't hard. I was on the Joint Staff at the time, so part of the planning process for both operations. And I remember no issues really with the Afghanistan operation. We knew that we'd been attacked. We knew there were ungoverned spaces. We knew there were military type camps being built and trained, and that's where the bombers from September 11th came from. There were plans. There were these expanding networks of a growing army across that Central Asia or Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, or Southwest Asia and Northern Africa. We knew how that transport network was happening. We knew how money was moving. But then the decision to say, okay, we're going to invade Iraq, which seemed strategically, we understood what the intelligence said. But the justification for doing that, am I going to do that from an ethical and moral standpoint? Am I going to participate in that? And that becomes the balance, as you rightly pointed out. Here's what the Constitution says. Here's what the laws say. Here's what Title 10 of the of U.S. Code says. Here is my oath that I took. For us in the Army, we have something called the Soldier's Creed, which is, 4 very specific warrior ethos statements, and this is what my purpose is, and this is what I do. I'll always place the mission first. I'll never accept defeat. I'll never quit. I'll never leave a fallen comrade. When you start, and so it's always balancing those things, and so it became a decision for me to say, yes, okay, I know I'm going to get orders at the end of this tour to go to Iraq, to be in this place making these decisions and supporting the decision makers doing those things. And that was the place where, but that was that I had probably my biggest ethical dilemma. I resolved it to my satisfaction, and again, it didn't matter to anybody but me that I was retirement eligible. I could have walked away. I chose not to. I chose to continue to serve. But it's from that kind of major decision to simple everyday decisions about, as I said, about am I going to court-martial or give a non-judicial punishment to this soldier for an infraction? Can I really justify giving up this money that's allocated to me in the budget to another organization when I really need this to accomplish my mission? But the orders are there to do it, and they're legal. So throughout every day, this is a part of what's in the back of your mind as you lead America's greatest treasure, its young men and women.
I was talking to you, Colonel Bales, about how many people you see the Pentagon outside of your window there, and how many civil servants we have, and Stephanie, you served in the Department of Defense, and how much they make up we the people. I know that is we the people is everyone in the United States, the voting age, all the voters in the United States, but there are hundreds of thousands of people that work for our government and that serve every day, that have dedicated their lives and have built up so much knowledge and expertise in their field. And I kind of want to just hold space for a second for those people, because I feel like we talk about bureaucracy and we malign some of that, but they are the people who every day are going out and acting in the name of we the people, dedicating their lives to it. And I think there just feels like sometimes they're a line item that people want to cut. And I don't know, I just wanted to put that out there, and I can let you all respond that, but that's something I'm feeling of late. One of the things I would like to just go around as we wrap up is what's a hope that you have connected to these words and the future of our country and where we're going to be headed. What's something what's a hope that you have or a path that you see? And I'll go to you first, Stephanie. What's something that you hope for the future?
Let me try to hit both of those questions.
Yeah.
And I would just say that I know that there's a lot of conversation these days about unelected bureaucrats and sort of deriding the civil service. In fact, one of my opponents used to call me Deep State Barbie, and I kind of wear it as a badge of honor because I understand, especially at, say, the Department of Defense, for example, the civilians that work there, they're apolitical. In fact, when I worked there, I wasn't registered as a Democrat or a Republican. I didn't register until I chose to run for election because it had been so drilled into me that when you work at the Department of Defense, you're not looking left or right to ask if you're a Democrat or a Republican. You're asking, what is the mission and how do I achieve that as an American? And I think what they offer is continuity because in all departments and agencies, but particularly at the Department of Defense, you have military officers and military uniformed folks who cycle in and out because they get 3-year assignments roughly, and depending. And then you also have political appointees, and those political appointees only stay for as long as the person who appointed them is there, or as long as they can really muster the speed at which you have to work in those types of jobs. And so as those people cycle in and out, the civil service is really the stability and sort of the institutional knowledge and the experience. And really, for as much as I've heard people say that they're politicized or otherwise, I think the civil service of anything, these are people who have survived administration after administration, working for Democrats, working for Republicans. They've been doing the same types of jobs, providing that continuity for our government, and understanding that they are marching in the direction of their political leaders. And if they find that they have a personal conflict that they can no longer do that, they leave. So I don't view them with that lens. I actually think they add an awful lot to reflecting the will of the people. And then real quickly, what gives me hope? It's the next generation. And so a deep, heartfelt thank you to the folks who are on this call who are doing that really difficult job of teaching the next generation about their responsibilities and their opportunities and their blessings. And I know, given the story I told about gun violence in Florida, I know that civics education can have a significant impact on policy in the future of this country. So thank you all, and really great to be with you all.
Colonel Bales, what gives you hope?
Tomorrow's going to be just like it is today. I think Jennifer wanted a debate, and far be it from the slope-foreheaded, jutting brown Neanderthal old soldier to be the guy who's going to debate a constitutional scholar. But I think you left out the word more perfect union. That it is the one word in the Constitution that says it's not done. That this is the more perfect. We're constantly trying to make this union more perfect. And every time a new technology or a new idea or a new fragment, accusation, political tool to get elected comes up, we tend to think that it's the first time it's ever been seen under the sun. It isn't. No, I think the fact that there are 700,000 civilian employees of the Department of Defense, 2.3 million men and women wearing uniforms, are going to be standing on the frontiers of freedom and democracy for a very, very long time. My son is one of them. And behind him, are my two grandchildren and the one on the way. It is imperative. I am, again, I will say that I am so grateful that teachers like this assembly are driving the lessons home. Even if it doesn't, even if the kids forget, take the test and forget, they will come back to it at some point. We'll have the reference to go back and say, wait, what? My Mrs. So-and-so said this. Maybe that's a thing I should go read. So tomorrow's going to be fine, as long as we hold the line today. And that's us and our posterity.
Professor Amar, I'll give you the last word here. What gives you hope?
People on this webinar, thank you very much. Thank you for your service. We've been talking about civics, and there are different aspects of civics, and you all teach civics. There's civic service of the sort that Stephanie and Elliott do, civilian and military. We think about civic engagement or civic involvement, voting and serving on juries and petitioning your member of Congress and working to make our schools safer with a better policies on guns, for example. So there's civic service and civic engagement and participation, and civilian supremacy is actually connected in Latin and other ways to the idea of civics. But then there's also civic education. And I'm an educator, and so are the people on this webinar, and that involves teaching the next generation. And now I'm going to be blunt, okay, because I'm not as completely Panglossian and optimistic. I'm a father of three. All my three kids went to fancy schools. Yale, Georgetown, Yale, and I know they're friends, and they're very impressive. I have some of the best students in America at Yale College and Yale Law School. 4 of my former students are senators of the United States. One is the National Security Advisor. One is an incoming Congresswoman from New Hampshire, Maggie Goodlander, who's married to Jake Sullivan. And that generation was pretty awesome, truthfully, of students. My current students, actually, I have to be honest, they're illiterate. They don't read books, not just civics books, but books in general. This is a huge problem for my kids and their friends, because this thing has made them stupid. I'm being honest, and my fellow educators will know that I'm speaking the truth to them. And here's so I have hope, but I also have concerns, because Stephanie, you came and you were so proud to be an American, because you didn't take it for granted, and neither do I, because I'm lucky that they let my family in, shortly before I was born. But when I was 8 years old, I could stand up and close my eyes and recite all my presidents, and I still can. And very few of my students can do this. Very few. They don't even know the names of the presidents, much less who they were and what they did. And forget, just 52 words is so, unambitious. Okay. So you have to push your students. They're not going to want to be pushed. Mine don't want to be pushed either. I'm telling you, educator to educator, that we actually have to have more civics education. Thank you. You're doing God's work, and not getting any credit for doing this, and parents are being mean to you, and your administrators and all the rest, and the students sometimes don't want to hear this. But the only thing that we have in common, we can't debate what words mean today, Jennifer, unless we know what they meant before. The only thing that we have in common is our history, the history behind the Constitution. Yeah, and that's why I say stuff like, read the whole darn Constitution, not just 52 words, and read about the subsequent generations that made amends, not just the founders. And yes, you're going to need to read and teach your students about books that ideally aren't partisan political screeds. I so admire Elliott and Stephanie, because they're not partisans. Okay, they're in service, and they believe in the general welfare, Jennifer. What's good for us all, not what's good for me or you, but what we have in common. Otherwise, we're not going to even be able to talk to each other, is our history. And we need to know it. You need to know that 8-year-olds need to know 10-year-olds, they're presidents. They do. And the story behind the Constitution, including the amendments. That would be, my big ask and pitch. So I have hope because of the teachers in the audience, I have fear because I actually think this generation has less civic knowledge than the one that preceded. I'm being honest because I'm maybe getting just a grumpy old man, but I've been teaching for 40 years and I see a difference. Alas.
Yeah. Well, it's hope and a charge to all of us who are in education to continue this. And I'm sure that our educators that are on here are take that charge seriously. And
That's why they're here.
yeah, exactly. And thank you so much, Professor Amar, Representative Murphy, and Colonel Bales. I really appreciated this conversation, and I feel like I'm walking away with some things to keep thinking about. And I just really appreciate you spending some time with us. Thank you, everybody. I'll be in touch via email, and you can look for the recording and a certificate of attendance. Take care, everybody.